The air in the ancient cavern deep within the Pyrenees was cool, resonant and heavy, with the scent of mineral-rich stone and something else, something indefinable, like the faint echo of a song so old it predated language itself, a melody that seemed to vibrate through the rock formations as if the earth itself was remembering how to sing. A single shaft of sunlight, filtered through a natural aperture aligned with celestial precision, illuminated a series of paintings on the cavern wall that defied conventional archaeological dating, images so vivid they seemed alive despite their impossible age. The paintings depicted not the usual hunting scenes or handprints of Paleolithic art, but something far more enigmatic. Women with arms raised, mouths open in what could only be song, and above them, around them, emerging from them, magnificent dragons whose forms seemed to merge with sound waves, visualized as spiraling patterns that filled the entire composition. At the base of the painted wall, carved into the living stone, were symbols that resembled musical notation but predated any known system of writing music, as if someone had attempted to transcribe the song the dragon mothers sang when they brought worlds into being. Before these paintings, a lone figure stood in silence, their throat tight with an emotion they couldn't name, their whole body vibrating with a frequency that matched something in the stone, in the images, in the air itself. From the depths of the cavern, from the earth below and the stone around, a harmonic resonance began to build, not quite sound, but not quite silence either, a presence that seemed to be waiting, listening, inviting. What if creation itself was not the word of a masculine god speaking reality into existence, but the song of the dragon mothers, the divine feminine voices that sang the frequencies that became matter? And what if this primordial creative power of the feminine voice was so threatening to emerging patriarchal structures that it had to be systematically silenced, not just metaphorically through the suppression of women's voices in religion and culture, but literally through the forgetting of the sonic technologies the ancients understood, the knowledge that certain voices singing certain frequencies could heal, could transform consciousness, could literally reshape reality at the quantum level. What timeless secret did these impossible paintings preserve, and what profound revelation awaited the one who dared to remember that before the word was the song, before language was sound, before thought was vibration, and that the dragon mothers who mastered this primordial creative force were not mythological, but historical, not metaphorical, but actual practitioners of a science we lost when we silenced the feminine voice of creation. My name is Lyra, and the call to something beyond had been a persistent vibration in my consciousness since childhood, when I discovered that my voice could do things that shouldn't be possible, that when I sang certain tones in certain ways, people around me would enter altered states, physical pain would diminish, emotional wounds would begin to heal, and sometimes, in moments I couldn't control or predict, reality itself seemed to shift, as if my voice was touching something fundamental in the structure of what is. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense, no audible instruction, but a deep knowing that my voice was not just mine, that it carried something ancient, something that wanted to be remembered and reclaimed. My journey began not with mystical experiences, but with academic frustration, researching the role of women in ancient spirituality for my doctoral thesis, and encountering again and again the same pattern. In the earliest layers of every tradition, before patriarchal revisions, women were the singers, the chanters, the ones who used voice as sacred technology. In Sumerian temples, the priestesses sang the hymns that opened portals between worlds. In Egyptian ritual, the women's voices called forth the gods. In Greek mystery schools, it was the female initiates whose singing induced the ecstatic states necessary for transformation. In indigenous cultures worldwide, the grandmothers were the keepers of the sacred songs, the ones who sang the world into being each morning, who sang the sick back to health, who sang the dead to the other side. But in every case, as patriarchal religions consolidated power, women's voices were progressively silenced, forbidden to sing in sacred contexts, excluded from roles that required use of voice as spiritual authority. In recurring dreams that intensified as my research deepened, I found myself in caves like the one I would later discover in the Pyrenees, witnessing women who were not quite human, or were human, but also something more, singing together in harmonics so complex they created visible patterns in the air, patterns that became solid, that became reality itself. They called themselves the Dragon Mothers, and they explained without words that the dragon was not separate from them, but was the visible manifestation of their song, that when they sang in perfect harmony with the frequencies of creation, the energy took form as dragons, as serpents of light and sound that could weave matter into new configurations. These visions left me shaking, desperate to find any evidence that such knowledge had existed. It was in an obscure footnote in a text on archaeoacoustics that I found the first clue, a reference to anomalous acoustic properties in certain Paleolithic caves, properties that suggested they had been designed or selected for specific resonant frequencies, and that the paintings in these caves correlated with their acoustic sweet spots in ways that implied the art and the sound were intimately connected. The path that followed that discovery was not one of comfortable academic research, but an all-consuming quest that took me to caves across Europe and beyond, measuring their acoustic properties, studying their art, and slowly, terrifyingly, learning to reproduce the frequencies I found encoded in the images. Each step brought resistance, both internal and external. There was the scientific skepticism that insisted I was seeing patterns where none existed, that the acoustic properties were coincidence, that any suggestion of intentional acoustic design in Paleolithic caves was pseudoscientific fantasy. There was my own fear of what I was discovering, the growing evidence that our ancestors understood sound in ways we've forgotten, that they built temples and chose cave sites based on acoustic resonance, that they knew certain frequencies could alter consciousness, heal the body, and perhaps even affect matter directly. And there was the visceral terror that came from the experiences I began having when I sang the frequencies I'd reconstructed, moments when reality felt thin, when I could sense vast presences responding to the sounds, when my voice seemed to touch something that had been waiting in silence for thousands of years to hear the song again. External resistances manifested as well. My doctoral committee refused to accept my thesis, calling it unscholarly speculation. Funding dried up when I persisted. I was warned by more than one mentor that pursuing this line of research would destroy my academic career. Yet there were also unexpected allies. An elderly woman from the Basque country, hearing of my research, came to one of my lectures and afterward pulled me aside. Her eyes were dark as the caves themselves as she spoke. My grandmother taught me songs she said were older than Christianity, older than the Romans, older than memory. She said they were the songs the mothers sang before the fathers came with their words and their weapons. She said the mothers sang creation itself, that their voices were dragons of sound that shaped what is. She said the songs were forbidden when the new priests came, when they declared that only men could speak to God, that women's voices in sacred space were sinful. But some grandmothers kept singing in secret, kept the melodies alive even after the words were forgotten. I will teach you what she taught me, if you promise to remember why these songs matter. I promised, and she taught me, and when I sang the melodies she shared, I felt something in my DNA respond, some cellular memory of a time when women's voices were not silenced but sacred, not feared but revered, as the instruments through which the divine spoke reality into being. The techniques the Basque grandmother taught me, combined with the frequencies I'd reconstructed from the cave acoustics, created something I hadn't expected. A practice, a trainable skill for using voice as transformative technology. I began teaching it quietly to small groups, mostly women initially, showing them how to find the resonant frequency of their own body, how to sing into pain or trauma and literally vibrate it loose, how to harmonize with others to create interference patterns that could induce profound altered states. The results were sometimes dramatic, sometimes subtle, but always indicated that something real was happening, that voice used in specific ways could affect consciousness and even physical healing in measurable ways. But the deeper mystery remained. Who were the Dragon Mothers, and what had they really understood? The breakthrough came when I finally gained access to the cave in the Pyrenees, the one whose existence I'd learned of through a cryptic reference in a medieval manuscript that described a cave of the Singing Mothers, where the painted dragons come alive when the old songs are sung. Finding it required months of searching, but when I finally stood before those paintings of women singing dragons into being, I knew I'd found the source, the place where the knowledge had been preserved, not in texts, but in stone and sound. I spent days in that cave, measuring its acoustics, studying the paintings, and finally, when I felt ready, or perhaps when I could no longer resist, I sang. I sang the frequencies I'd learned from the Basque grandmother, the tones I'd reconstructed from acoustic analysis, harmonics I'd discovered in my own practice, weaving them together into something that felt less like performance and more like remembrance, like my voice was recalling a song it had sung before, in lifetimes I couldn't consciously access. And as I sang, something extraordinary occurred. The painted dragons on the wall seemed to move, to shimmer, to become dimensional, and the air in the cave filled with visible patterns of sound, cymatics made manifest, geometric forms that swirled and coalesced. I was no longer alone. The space was filled with presences, and one came forward with such clarity I could almost see her, a woman or something that wore woman's form, and she spoke not in words, but in understanding that flooded my awareness. We were the Dragon Mothers, the singers of the first songs, and what you call dragons were the visible manifestations of our voices when we sang in harmony with the fundamental frequencies of creation itself. We understood what your science is beginning to rediscover, that everything is vibration, that matter is frozen sound, that the right frequencies can heal or harm, create or destroy. We sang the sick back to health, sang rain from the sky, sang the crops to grow, sang consciousness into altered states where the veils between worlds grew thin. Our voices were not entertainment or communication alone, but technology, tools of creation and transformation. And then came the fathers with their new gods, gods who spoke words rather than sang songs, gods who were jealous of our power, who feared what we could do with our voices. They declared our songs witchcraft, our power demonic, our voices dangerous. They silenced us, not just by forbidding us to sing, but by making us forget why our voices mattered, by teaching generations of women that their voices were shrill, annoying, not to be raised, not to take up space. The silencing was so complete that even the memory of what we could do was erased. But the knowledge was never destroyed, only buried. It lives in the stones that remember the frequencies, in the DNA that carries the capacity, in the dreams that call you back to remembrance. You who have found this place, who have sung the songs again, you are not discovering but reclaiming. The Dragon Mother's song was never truly silenced, only waiting for voices brave enough to sing it again. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. When the presence faded and I found myself alone again in the cave, my voice was hoarse, my body trembling, my face wet with tears I didn't remember shedding. But I understood now with devastating clarity why women's voices had been silenced, why, across cultures and centuries, the same pattern repeated. Women forbidden to preach, to teach, to sing in sacred contexts, told their voices were inferior or dangerous or simply unwelcome. It wasn't because women's voices were actually inferior, but because they carried a power that patriarchal structures found intolerable, a creative force that didn't need masculine validation or permission, that could bypass priestly hierarchies and speak directly to the divine, or more accurately, could speak the divine directly into manifestation. The Dragon Mothers represented a form of spiritual authority that was fundamentally democratic because everyone has a voice, fundamentally feminine because it was based on creation rather than domination, fundamentally threatening because it couldn't be controlled by those who wanted to monopolize access to the sacred. The silencing of women's voices wasn't incidental to the establishment of patriarchal religion. It was essential, because as long as women remembered they could sing reality into being, no priest could claim unique authority to speak for God. The months that followed were of integration and decision about what to do with what I'd experienced and understood. I withdrew from the academic world that had rejected my research, spent time in silence, and then slowly, carefully, began to sing again. This time not alone, but teaching others, creating circles where women especially, but also men, could reclaim the voice as sacred technology, could learn the frequencies that heal and transform, could remember that before there was the word, there was the song, and that we all carry in our throats the capacity to be creators, to be dragon mothers in our own right, singing new realities into being. I began to travel, teaching what I called voice as sacred technology, workshops where I shared the acoustic principles I'd discovered, the practices for finding one's resonant frequency, the techniques for using voice to heal trauma and transform consciousness. But I also taught the history, the story of the Dragon Mothers who had been silenced, helping participants understand that when they were told as children that they couldn't sing, or that their voice was annoying, or that they should be quiet, they were receiving not just personal criticism, but the echo of a millennia-old program designed to suppress the creative power of the voice, especially women's voices. The response was profound. Women wept as they sang for the first time without shame or self-consciousness, feeling their voices as power rather than embarrassment. Men discovered that reclaiming reverence for the voice meant reclaiming reverence for the feminine creative principle that the voice embodied. We created sonic healing circles where groups would sing together, harmonizing not to pretty melodies, but to frequencies that induced the theta states where deep healing becomes possible. Where we reported experiences of past life memories emerging, of spontaneous physical healings, of consciousness expanding beyond individual boundaries into collective fields where we could feel each other's emotions and sometimes even thoughts. Critics said we were delusional, that any effects were placebo or mass hysteria. But the consistency of the experiences, the measurable changes in consciousness, states verified by EEG monitoring we sometimes employed, the physical healings documented by medical tests before and after, all suggested that something real was occurring, that voice used intentionally, with knowledge of frequency and resonance, could indeed affect matter, consciousness, and health in ways that modern science was only beginning to understand, but that the Dragon Mothers had mastered long ago. My final work in this phase was to create a comprehensive text and audio program I called Reclaiming the Dragon Mother's Song, Voice as Sacred Creative Technology. In it, I presented everything I'd learned, the archaeological and anthropological evidence for voice as sacred technology in ancient cultures, the physics of how frequency affects matter and consciousness, the history of how women's voices were systematically silenced as patriarchal religions consolidated power, and most importantly, the practical exercises for reclaiming voice as tool of healing and creation. I included recordings of the frequencies I'd reconstructed from the caves, guided practices for vocal toning and harmonic singing, meditations for clearing the throat chakra where voice-related trauma is often stored. I dedicated it to the Dragon Mothers, known and unknown, named and unnamed, whose songs had created worlds and who had been forced into silence, but whose knowledge had never been fully destroyed, only waiting for the time when voices would be ready to remember and reclaim what had been lost. The night before I released the program publicly, I returned to the cave in the Pyrenees one final time, bringing with me a group of advanced students, women who had trained in the vocal practices and who were ready to sing the Dragon Mother's song in its fullness. We stood before the ancient paintings as sunset light filtered through the cave entrance, creating the perfect acoustic moment that the cave's designers had perhaps intended, and together we sang. We sang the frequencies that heal, the harmonics that transform consciousness, the tones that our bodies and the earth itself recognize as the language of creation. We sang not as performance, but as ritual, as reclamation, as the voice of the silenced feminine finally breaking free from millennia of imposed quiet. And as we sang, all of us felt it, the presence of the Dragon Mothers, not as distant ancestors, but as living patterns in the consciousness field, recognizing themselves in us, their song continuing through our voices, their creative power reclaimed through our willingness to remember that we too are creators, that our voices are not mere communication tools, but sacred instruments through which the divine feminine speaks reality into new configurations. When the last harmonics faded into silence, I spoke aloud what we all felt. The Dragon Mothers were silenced but never destroyed, forgotten but never gone, waiting through ages of imposed quiet for voices brave enough to sing again. We are those voices. We who remember that creation is not a word spoken, but a song sung, not masculine decree, but feminine vibration bringing matter into form. We reclaim the voice as sacred, as powerful as the technology of creation it has always been. The silencing is ending, the song is returning, and every voice raised in healing, in truth, in creative power is the Dragon Mother's song continuing, is the feminine voice of creation reclaiming its rightful place not beneath the word but before it, as the primordial force from which all manifestation springs. And in the silence after speaking, we all heard it, could have sworn we heard it, echoing through the cave and perhaps through the collective field itself, the sound of dragon wings, the song of creation, the voice of the divine feminine that had been silent too long but would be silent no more. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.